Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 289. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, talking about the war in Ukraine, some news on how that war is going for the Ukrainian government and President Volodymyr Zelensky's plan to retake the Crimean Peninsula. So a lot of important stuff to get through on today's show. Please share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and it's also on the Libertarian Institute All podcast feed. So if you want to listen to the audio version of the podcast, there's, of course, the Conflicts of Interest feed everywhere. But if you also want to listen to Scott Horton's show, Keith Knight's Don't Tread on Anyone, Year Zero, Tommy Solomon's, Patrick McFarland's Liberty Weekly, be sure to, and the Scott Horton Show, of course, be sure to check out that podcast feed as well. For the video version of the show, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee, although we are steering people towards Rumble and Odysee, and you can find the links to all that in the show notes page. Of course, we recently beat a YouTube strike, won the appeal, but we don't count on that to happen again in the future. If we do get another strike, we won't be able to post for a week on YouTube. So if you're relying to get the show on YouTube, just switch over and subscribe somewhere else. That way, if you stop seeing them in your feed, you could go to Odysee or Rumble and quickly find the show. And then follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. The sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is PEACE, and they have great products at Paloma Verde. The sports cream is my personal favorite. I think maybe now the fan favorite, the one I get the most feedback on, is the CBD dog treats, and no longer people writing me to tell me they agree with me that the sports cream is their favorite. A lot of people, commenters, even in the YouTube video, will tell me, hey man, the CBD treats are either great for my aging dog or my super energetic dog. So, a lot of us got dogs now. I really would do anything for my pup. And so if you got a dog needs a little bit more help getting around, check out the CBD treats they got at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. And that will save you 20% when you check out, and it gets the show a kickback. That income that we get from Paloma Verde really does help the show, help to cover, some of the hosting fees and stuff, help us to improve equipment over time. And so if you use CBD, do your shopping at Paloma Verde and help out your favorite podcast that way. All right, now let's get into the episode. First article I wrote with Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute. And that was June 13th, titled Gitmo Detainee Pleads Guilty, Likely to be Transferred Under Agreement. One of the 37 men imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay Detention Center has pled guilty to 4 of 5 charges brought against him by the U.S. authorities, claiming he belonged to al-Qaeda and was responsible for war crimes in Afghanistan. Abd al-Hadi al-Iraqi, who says his real name is Nashwan al-Tamir, was brought to the U.S.-run prison in 2007 after he was captured by the CIA sometime late the year prior. He was accused of running an al-Qaeda training camp in Afghanistan before the 9/11 attacks, organizing strikes on American soldiers and civilians in the country after the U.S. invasion, also accused of targeting civilians in Pakistan, as well as destroying ancient religious sites. And I believe one of the sites that was actually named in the U.S. court filings was a 6th century Buddhist statue that he apparently alleged that this guy tore down. So al-Iraqi is believed to have been born in Iraq in he's now 60 years old and fought in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s and was a major in Saddam Hussein's army. After serving in Iraq, he traveled to Afghanistan to fight the Soviet occupation as a part of the Mujahideen, where U.S. officials say he became a key member of al-Qaeda sometime in the mid-1990s. Al-Iraqi was identified by Ahmed al-Darbi, a Saudi prisoner at Guantanamo Bay accused of being in al-Qaeda. One of al-Iraqi's defense lawyers has questioned the authenticity of al-Darbi's identification, arguing the man made the statements while under duress amid brutal treatment at the hands of U.S. authorities, which included being beaten, sleep deprived, hung by the wrist, threatened with rape in interrogation, and sent into unwanted retinal exams by U.S. doctors, kept nude, and forced to empty other detainees' fecal buckets with his fingers. Under the terms of al-Awlaki's plea deal, reached following a years-long military tribunal, he is expected to be transferred from Guantanamo Bay to unspecified third country, according to the AP. And so, I think there's still should remain questions about the man who was actually in Guantanamo Bay, al-Awlaki or Altamir, whichever I guess the guy goes by now, and whether he is the man who is alleged to have committed these crimes, given the role of the torture in figuring out allegedly that this guy carried out the crimes. And he could be pleading guilty here, seeing it as the only way he'll ever get out of Guantanamo Bay. And so I'm guess just because he's pleading guilty doesn't mean he really is guilty, but he very well could be. And it does seem that if he has committed these crimes, what people face in Guantanamo Bay wasn't the way anybody should be treated, but in the sense of any kind of justice being done here, it seems that he's probably served that, and he has some serious medical conditions. We write, however, al-Awlaki faces serious medical issues due to a spinal condition. He sued the U.S. government for medical neglect and deliberate indifference towards his health, which has worsened to the point he is now paralyzed from the waist down, unable to control his bladder and bowels. And so I think, if he is a horrible person who committed these crimes, you could probably transfer him from Gitmo, just based on the fact that, being unable to, go to the bathroom or walk probably prevents you from being any kind of meaningful terrorist. Now, just a couple other notes on Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. sent Mohammed Almir al-Qahani to Saudi Arabia. This was in March. He's accused of being the 20th hijacker and has had schizophrenia since he was young. And then there were 5 other detainees who were cleared for release earlier in the year. No idea when they're going to be out. There's a long process to gain out of Guantanamo Bay. And, depending, it seems sometimes that people who are actually guilty, known to be guilty of more serious crimes, are able to get out faster because their trials move along, where people whose guilt is more in question end up being stuck in Guantanamo Bay. All right, now let's move on and talk about some news dealing with the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion, NATO issues. We have here an article from myself and Will Porter on June 14th. Zelensky vows to liberate Crimea as Ukrainian officials voice alarm over Russian gains. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has promised that his forces will retake the Crimean Peninsula, which was annexed by Russia in 2014, despite warnings from other officials that Kiev will soon lose the Donbass region to Moscow without substantial military aid from the West. The leader pledged to recapture Russian-controlled region in a video message on Monday, stating that the Ukrainian flag will once again fly over Yalta and several other major cities on the Crimean Peninsula. He also said, "Of course, we will also liberate our Crimea." Zelensky went on to say that Ukraine would also retake the Donbass region. That's the country's eastern region, of course, that the Russian invasion is now mainly focused in. Mariupol, the Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk, this is where the fighting is going on. It's believed that Russia now controls about all, if not all, of the Luhansk region, and then I think over 50%, but it's exactly unclear of what the percentage is of the Donetsk region, and together they make up the historic Donbass. Russia has also made gains outside of the Donbass in eastern Ukraine and also south, moving north from the Crimean Peninsula. So, despite Zelensky's optimism, however, Ukrainian officials offered a far less promising assessment in comments to the Wall Street Journal, which noted that without broad, rapid increase in military assistance, Kiev faces defeat in the Donbass. An advisor to Ukraine's interior minister said, "Victory will be with the side that has more and better weapons, and that if Western nations fail to supply sufficient arms, Ukraine will bleed out." The journal reported that Moscow currently has 10 to 20 artillery pieces for every unit operated by Ukraine along the front lines and significantly more ammunition. I believe I read from Daniel L. Davis that it's 1 to 40 on the ammunition. And Russia's carrying out far more airstrikes than Ukraine is. Ukraine's only able to carry out a few aerial missions a day, where Russia is maybe carrying out a few hundred on some days. Though Russia devoted more attention to Ukraine's western half in the initial phase of the attack, it has since shifted its focus to the Donbass, which it has vowed to liberate from Ukrainian control on behalf of the two separatist states, Donetsk and Luhansk. As of early June, Moscow held at least 20% of Ukraine, a figure acknowledged by Zelensky himself, much of it in the country's east and south. Washington alone has provided tens of billions of dollars in security assistance to Ukraine since Russia invaded in February, an additional wave of arms transferred from allies countries across Europe. And then just today, we don't actually have this in the article because the news is so new, the U.S. approved another $1 billion in weapons transfers to Ukraine. I'm still working on collecting all the details of that, but one thing I saw in the defense news post was that part of the weapons included the Harpoon missiles, which the U.S. has discussed transferring to Ukraine to take out the Russian ships in the Black Sea. So, let's see. Recent Pentagon shipments include long-range rocket systems capable of striking targets 50 miles away, well beyond the range of the U.S.-made artillery already provided, despite concerns that this weapon will be used for attacks on Russian soil. Still, officials in Kiev are demanding more from the U.S., with senior Zelensky aide insisting on Monday that Ukraine needs heavy weapon parity in order to end the war. Towards that goal, he requested 1,000 howitzers, 300 multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS, 500 tanks, 2,000 armored vehicles, and 1,000 drones. And it doesn't appear that that's really out of line with what the U.S. is willing to do. This from June 13th at antiwar.com by Dave DeCamp. Pentagon says Ukraine will survive and the U.S. will arm it for years to come. On Monday, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hitz said Pentagon leaders will believe the state of Ukraine will survive Russia's invasion and the U.S. is preparing to arm the country for years to come. This from Hits. I think we can assure ourselves today that there will be a country called Ukraine, and it will be a sovereign country, and that country will have a military, and it will need to defend it. She added. And so we look ahead and we're thinking what kinds of capabilities that Ukraine needs to protect themselves over the long term. Dave writes, so far the U.S. has allocated about $54 billion to spend on Ukraine's war effort, the majority of which will go towards military assistance. The funds are meant to last through the 2022 fiscal year, which ends September 30th for the federal government. But Hitt said that the Pentagon is looking to support Ukraine in the long term over the next 5, 10, 20 years in the future. We're trying to think through the kinds of both weapons and equipment, also any kind of longer-term training defense efforts they will need, she said. Hitt's comment signaled the Biden administration has no plans to reduce tensions with Russia as one of Moscow's main motivations to invade Kiev. Kiev's alignment with the U.S. and NATO and the military support Western powers started to provide in 2014. So, a lot going on there, especially with the weapons transfers today that happened. A few more stories to deal with weapons. This from Will Porter. I am not on this byline with him at the Libertarian Institute. Written, I think this morning, June 15th. He writes, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte has called to equip Ukrainian forces with enough weapons and gear to defend the Russian military, arguing that Kiev must deal the blows as direct confrontation between NATO and Moscow is still off the table. Speaking to reporters after hosting a meeting with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and several European leaders on Tuesday, the Dutch Prime Minister said a Ukrainian victory may still be attainable if only the U.S.-led military bloc provides sufficient lethal aid. Seems he's even out of line with the officials in Kiev. In terms of weaponry, we stand here. We stand united here. It is crucial for Russia to lose this war. And he goes on to say, and we cannot have direct confrontation between NATO troops and Russia. What we need to do is to make sure that Ukraine can fight that war and that it has all the necessary weapons. And so, we really see here from another leader that this is a proxy war that the West is fighting with Russia in Ukraine. And that fighting is coming with serious losses for the Ukrainians. Just before recording, I saw reports from Ukrainian officials. So this is why, I'm going to take this pretty seriously, saying that Ukraine was suffering up to 1,000 casualties a day, and that included up to 500 deaths. And so this is significant losses that the Ukrainian forces are taking. And of course, so many of these people dying, I'm sure, are conscripts. And so, this whole thing that we've been saying kind of tongue-in-cheek about fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, we're talking about thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of Ukrainians who are going to die for this, Western victory that we're hoping for in Ukraine. So, another interesting thing going on here is, we had the Dutch Prime Minister expressing support for years to come, the U.S. doubling down. This isn't really a united position in Europe. Dave Ducamp writes on June 10th, Ukraine, it fears it might lose Western support over war fatigue. As the war in Ukraine drags on, Ukrainian officials fear Kiev might lose some Western support due to war fatigue. The U.S. and its allies have committed billions of dollars in weapons, but some Western European leaders have been calling for a negotiated solution to end the fighting, an idea Ukrainian officials have rejected. This is from Zelensky. The fatigue is growing. People want some kind of outcome that is beneficial for themselves, and they want another outcome for ourselves. And Zelensky is right about this, that some of these Western countries are willing to only give Ukraine so much money, so much aid, so much arms, because they see, some kind of diminishing returns on the investment of having Ukrainian soldiers kill Russians, right? And but at the same time, I wish Zelensky would maybe realize the cruel reality that he is facing and start to negotiate to save more of his people. The current situation on the battlefield is not looking good for Ukraine. Actually, this again just updated. So I think now 200 to 500 troops is the number that we're getting of potential killed in action for Ukrainian troops every day, and then up to 1,000 casualties. Before going on, I was talking with my good friend Joanne Leone, host of the Around the Empire podcast. It's been a while since I plugged her show on my show, and I just want to take a second to make sure everybody who's listening to this show goes out and subscribes to that one. But one important thing she pointed out is what kind of strain this must be putting on Ukraine's hospital system. Not only, I'm sure, are some medical facilities taken out because of either people fleeing Ukraine, and so there's no staff to operate those facilities, or, just due to warfare, one side or another destroyed them. But then you also will have maybe supply chain issues and things like that. And so it could be a real serious medical situation in Ukraine if you are piling up, a 500 troops a day, 700 troops a day that are being injured in battle. I mean, these are serious, serious numbers that we're talking about here. So let's see. I think I have a few other stories on arms. Actually, no, I think move on here and talk about some more of the diplomatic sanctions issues. The first story I have is one of the most interesting on today's show. U.S. quietly encourages more Russian fertilized deals to ease food cost. This from Dave DeCamp on June 13th. The U.S. has quietly encouraged shipping companies and agricultural companies to purchase transfer more Russian fertilizer to lower global food costs, as Western sanctions have disrupted supplies. U.S. and EU sanctions on Russia technically have exemptions for fertilizer, but the sanctions discourage shipping firms, insurance companies, and banks from doing business with Russia altogether. As a result, Russia's fertilizer exports are down 24% this year. Citing people familiar with the matter, the Bloomberg report said that the U.S. officials were surprised by the caution companies were taking over the sanctions. But history shows that even if there's built-in exemptions, sanctions still cause shortages of food and humanitarian goods. For example, U.S. sanctions on Iran technically have exemptions for medical goods, but still have cause medicine shortages in the country. And while, it may not come off at fertilizer as being the most obvious dual use item, if there are things that, come along with the fertilizer, things like that, different kinds of chemicals, this could become an issue where, the dual use list is often a problem where, masks or something like that, while our medical supplies, the U.S. could be used for military operations or things like that. And while we're, using all of these sanctions, Dave DeCamp on June 14th writes, Biden officials concerned Russia sanctions hurting ordinary people more than Putin. Bloomberg again reported on Tuesday that some Biden administration officials are privately expressing concern that sanctions on Russia are worsening the global food crisis, exacerbating inflation, and hurting ordinary Russians more than President Vladimir Putin. I'm not sure where you could have heard that analysis in February, but I'm pretty sure that me and Connor Freeman were talking about it several times on this show. History has shown that U.S. sanctions and other economic pressures do little to change targeted governments and always hurt civilian populations. For example, Cuba has been under U.S. economic embargo since 1962, but the same government remains in power decades later while the people have suffered. The U.S. typically targets smaller countries with the harsh sanctions it imposed on Russia, such as Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and Syria, but the sanctions campaign against Russia, the world's 11th largest economy by gross domestic product, has also a significant impact on the economies of the U.S. and Europe, a consequence President Biden warned Americans to be prepared for. The Bloomberg report said that the Biden administration was surprised by the number of Western countries that decided to exit Russia and to stop doing business with the country altogether, even if the sanctions allowed it. The exodus has caused supply chain bottlenecks and uninsurable grain export issues. Now, one thing that, I want to add in my own analysis here, Dave's article is absolutely fantastic, but the Biden administration has really also encouraged, and so has a lot of our Western allies, this cultural boycott of all things Russian as well. And so I think that probably contributes to what we're talking about here, is not just concerned that these countries are going to violate sanctions, but that they're going to be called out for still doing business in Russia and face, market penalties in the United States by the hysteria created by the Biden administration and their promotion of Russophobia. Back to Dave's article. According to the Yale Chief Executive Leadership Institute, about 1,000 companies have ended or eliminated their business in Russia. This has left assets behind that the Russian government could take control of and left markets open that Russia firms can now enter with less competition. History also tells us that international banks and businesses tend not to do business with countries targeted by heavy U.S. sanctions over fears of violating them, even if there are exemptions for certain goods. For example, U.S. sanctions on Iran technically have exemption for medical supplies and other humanitarian goods, but they still cause medical shortages. In a statement last year on the medical shortages in Iran, a group of UN experts said many banks and businesses, including pharmaceutical and medical companies around the world, over-comply with sanctions out of fear of potential penalties. But the Biden administration officials are still acting as if surprised by the Western sanctions are disrupting the supply of exempted goods. Fertilizer is exempt from sanctions, but Russia export of the commodity has dropped by 24% this year. So the sanctions are not working. The U.S., I believe, announced another round of sanctions pretty recently, and I'm guessing we're going to see one in the coming weeks. let's see, a couple more things. Stoltenberg says that steps are being taken. Wait. One more article here from myself and Will Porter. U.S. official admits Russian energy sales outpacing pre-war levels. This is a very important article. U.S. Energy Secretary Envoy Amos Hochstein has acknowledged that Russia might be taking more revenue from fossil fuels than before its February invasion of Ukraine. He said he made the comments during a hearing for the Senate Subcommittee on Europe and Regional Security Cooperation in response to a question about whether Moscow was making more money now off its fossil fuels. Heitstein said, "I can't deny that." And the International Energy Agency said Russian fossil fuel revenue was up 50% this year. All right. Now, I just want to add that the EU will grant Ukraine status as a candidate country, not an official member, but that does give Ukraine a little bit more influence and ability to, interact with the EU. I think you start to get some of the economic benefits then. And then let's move on now and talk about, I think, one of the more important articles that me and Will have written in this past week. U.S. Chinese officials warn of looming conflict over Taiwan. This from June 14th at the Libertarian Institute. Tensions between China and the U.S. continue to escalate. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin warned of Ukraine-like crisis in Taiwan, accusing Beijing of pursuing aggressive foreign policies after trading threats over the disputed island with his Chinese counterpart. Delivering a fiery speech on Sunday in Singapore, the Pentagon chief claimed that Washington had witnessed a steady increase in provocative and destabilizing military activities near Taiwan, adding that the PRC's moves threatened to undermine security, stability, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. That's crucial for this region, it's crucial for the wider world, Austin said. Austin went on to claim that China had degraded the rules-based international order and is following a more coercive and aggressive approach to its territorial claims, stating that could spark a Ukraine-like conflict over Taiwan, which Beijing considers a part of China proper. This is still Austin. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is what happens when oppressors trample over the rules that protect us all. It's what happens when big powers decide that their imperial appetites matter more than the rights of their peaceful neighbors. He continued, noting it's a preview of a possible world of chaos and turmoil that none of us want to live in. Though China has rejected similarities between Taiwan and Ukraine, U.S. officials have repeatedly made the comparison, some even urging Taiwanese officials to look to Ukraine's alleged successes in fending off Russian forces as a playbook for countering China, according to Politico. Since President Biden took office, Washington has sent warships through the disputed Taiwan Strait on a monthly basis, triggering a series of harsh reprimands from Beijing. Biden has also approved several rounds of our sales to Taipei in line with policies of his predecessor Donald Trump. On Monday, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Yanbin reiterated that the strait falls within China's territorial waters and exclusive economic zone, saying his claim is supported by international law. China enjoys sovereign rights and jurisdiction over Taiwan Strait while respecting the legitimate rights of other countries in the relevant maritime areas, the Wang said. The statement followed a rare face-to-face meeting between Austin and his Chinese defense minister Wei Fengya in Singapore last Friday, where the two reportedly sparred over the Taiwan issue. This is a statement from the Chinese Defense Ministry, and this is allegedly what Wade told Austin. If anyone dares to split Taiwan from China, the Chinese military has no choice but to fight at all costs and take all necessary measures to crush any attempt by Taiwan separatists to split Taiwan from the motherland. The official went on to accuse the U.S. of interfering in China's internal affairs by keeping direct bilateral relations with Taipei, and warned that no one should ever underestimate the resolve and ability of Chinese armed forces to safeguard its territorial integrity. We went on to slam Washington's Indo-Pacific policy during his own speech in Singapore, saying it seeks to create conflict and confrontation in the region to contain and encircle others. Towards that end, he said Washington was working to assemble an international anti-China coalition in the name of a free and open Indo-Pacific. The Pentagon has indicated that it does not take China's warning seriously and will not end its provocative maneuvers in the Taiwan Strait, with Defense Department spokesperson Martin Miners directly stating that the U.S. military will continue to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, and that includes transitioning through the Taiwan Strait. So, of course here, China is... I wouldn't, there's a long, complicated history between China and its ownership of the Taiwanese island. But obviously, looking at it from a contemporary standpoint, it's hard to, deny that there's a lot of people in Taiwan who do not want to be ruled by Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party. And obviously, you sympathize with that. At the same time, the U.S. can't fight a war for Taiwan halfway across the world on the other side of the Pacific Ocean and pretend like that's going to be any more winnable than Ukraine has been in Russia. And so looking at this, mitigation, tension reduction, and hopefully, longer term separation will allow, some kind of sustainable future that at least somewhat respects the increased freedoms of the people of Taiwan. But at the same time, the U.S. can't really ensure any of that. And what happens in Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait, and China should be decided in Asia and not in America. I think that's probably the most important lesson that the Americans need to take from this. The U.S. did announce in recent weeks plan to sell Taiwan $120 million in warship upgrades. There's a new bill in Congress that would give White House the power to cut trade with China. It has bipartisan support. An interesting round of sanctions. The Treasury sanctioned 3 American businesses. It blacklisted them from doing certain kinds of businesses, alleging it sent certain blueprints for some systems to China. And then I saw discussions by the Treasury Secretary of lifting some of the U.S. tariffs against China in order to ease inflation. And then another interesting note here, the U.S. Coast Guard carried out joint drills, I believe anti-narcotics operations with Japan. Now, one more, China issue on the radar is a little bit more on the periphery because Cambodia isn't Taiwan, but nonetheless, this is becoming a little bit more of a big story, and I think it will be in weeks to come. In anti-China fear-mongering we're going to see in the U.S. So at Responsible Statecraft on June 13th, Daniel Larison had a very important op-ed. Washington flips out again over possible Chinese base in Cambodia. Last week, Cambodia and China held a groundbreaking ceremony for a modernization project at Cambodia's Ream Naval Base. The ceremony came on the heels of a report from the Washington Post alleging that China is secretly building a portion of the naval facility for exclusive use by the Chinese military. Both governments were quick to deny that China has been allowed to establish its own military base in the country, and the Cambodian government insisted that their constitution prohibits foreign military bases on their soil. China is funding the modernization of the facility, and it seems likely that Chinese forces would also be able to make use of it in the future, but it is a modest development that doesn't warrant a severe reaction from the United States. The U.S. has worried about possible Chinese installations in Cambodia for many years, and Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman pointedly warned Cambodia about the dangers of hosting Chinese bases when she visited the country in 2021. Some media outlets have echoed the government's alarmed response. One New York Times headline blared, "New Chinese naval base signals a new era of competition in the Asia-Pacific region." It's not even certain there will be Chinese naval bases in southern Cambodia, and even if there will be one, it won't amount to very much. The same article asserts that the establishment of the Chinese naval base in Cambodia would boost Beijing's aspirations to become a true global power with a network of military facilities around the world. Not to be outdone in fear-mongering, the Wall Street Journal published an editorial warning about the Chinese Navy's Great Leap Forward. The editorial refers to the proliferation of PLA bases, but cannot point to a single new base that resulted from the supposed proliferation. Contrary to breathless reporting and commentary, China does not stand much to gain at all from its access to the base and is far from being the start of a Chinese empire of bases. For one thing, the Cambodian facility in question is not very large, so whether it benefits to offer the PLA Navy would be commensurately limited. John Bamford analyzed that the potential significance of a Chinese military base earlier this year and concluded it would have a modest impact on overall military balance. For that reason, Bradford wrote, "The American diplomatic response seems ham-fisted or even counterproductive." Chen Henning has also pointed out that Cambodia geographically is not well suited for Chinese needs. Most notably, the waters off Cambodia's coast are not very deep enough for useful to a powerful military. So, of course, if you have a big aircraft carrier, you need a lot of water to be able to sail that thing, and you can't sail it in a pond because it's too shallow. And so if you have a shallow bottomed sea or bay or something like that, like you also have in the Sea of Azov, it just offers limited military usefulness because you can have a ship with a lot of displacement in those waters. Whatever the Chinese military gets from having access to this facility will be constrained to the fact that the Cambodia government does not appear to be compromising on its sovereignty. More to the point, a Chinese base in Cambodia would not be a threat to the U.S. or allied security. While Goldstein of Defense Priorities commented in response to the Post report, overreacting to expected developments related to China's rise would not make America safer or more prosperous, and is likely to escalate regional tensions. So there's a little bit more to the Larson article, but that I think covers the main points I wanted to hit on. Wanted to talk about the Korea issue again. I've been hitting on a lot on the show, but I do think that there's a high potential, if not a nuclear test coming in the coming weeks. A lot of escalation between the U.S., South Korea, Japan, and North Korea because I'll just go ahead and get into this article. Blinken says U.S. to maintain pressure on North Korea until it changes course. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on June 13th. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Monday that the United States will maintain pressure on North Korea through sanctions until the country changes course as tensions on the Korean Peninsula are soaring. Until the regime in Pyongyang changes its current course, we will continue to keep the pressure on, Blinken told reporters after a meeting with his South Korean counterpart. Blinken said that the U.S. is open to dialogue with North Korea, but the Biden administration has not offered any incentives to bring Pyongyang to the table, such as sanctions relief. In the meantime, North Korea has been conducting frequent missile tests. The U.S. and Seoul responded to a North Korean test last week by launching 8 ballistic missiles into the sea off South Korea's coast. The missile launch marked another more hawkish response from the U.S. and South Korea, and came not long after South Korea's new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, who vowed to take a firmer stance on Pyongyang, was sworn into office. The U.S. is now worrying that North Korea may conduct its first nuclear test since 2017. Last week, Secretary of State Wendy Sherman warned there would be a forceful response if Pyongyang carried out a nuclear test. During Monday's meeting, Park said he and Blinken agreed to start and extend the deterrence working group, which deals with the U.S. nuclear umbrella. President Yoon wants the U.S. to return nuclear bombers and submarines to the Korean Peninsula, but it's not clear if Washington will be agreeable to that deployment. So lots of really important stuff developing on the Korean Peninsula. Since Dave wrote this article, North Korea carried out an artillery test, and the South Korean intelligence said that North Korea is ready to carry out a nuclear test. At this point, it's just a political decision. So probably more if it will happen than when. Last article on today's show from myself and Will Porter, published today at the Libertarian Institute. Israel spyware firm seeking to sell hacking tech to U.S. defense contractor. The U.S. military contractor L3 Harris is planning to purchase controversial hacking technology from the Israeli firm NSO Group. The Tel Aviv-based spyware company was placed on the U.S. sanctions blacklist. The Tel Aviv based spyware company was placed on the U.S. sanctions blacklist after several governments used its Pegasus espionage tool to target politicians, diplomats, and human rights groups. The prospective deal would see L3 Harris purchase NSO surveillance tech and related coding, as well as the possible transfer of employees from the Israeli company. This was a joint report from the Washington Post, The Guardian, and Haaretz, and cited multiple unnamed sources. Any agreement will still need the approval of the U.S. and Israeli governments, as well as the L3 Harris board of directors. The Joe Biden administration denied any knowledge of the pending sale and signaled it would not support the idea, with the White House stating that such a transaction, were to take place, would raise serious counterintelligence and security concerns for the U.S. government. A senior U.S. official reached by The Guardian elaborated on potential problems with the deal, as the NSO Group is currently subject to American sanctions. He said any agreement would spur intense review to examine whether the transactions pose a counterintelligence threat to the U.S. government, and its systems and information, whether U.S. entity equities within the defense contractors may be at risk, to what extent a foreign entity or government raises a degree of access control, and the broader human rights implications. The NSO Group became embroiled in a series of scandals and lawsuits linked to its Pegasus tool, which can be used to hack into cell phones without anybody clicking on anything. They send you a message to your WhatsApp. That message is able to do its business and delete itself without you ever knowing it was there. Late last year, Washington added the firm to the sanctions entity list, stating the product has been used by foreign states to maliciously target government officials, journalists, business people, activists, academics, and embassy workers. Addressing the potential deal with NSO and concerns over spying tools, an L3 Harris spokesperson said the company is aware of the capability, and we are constantly evaluating our customers' national security needs, but added at this point anything beyond that is speculation. Among other technologies, L3 Harris produces Stingray and Hailstorm cell phone monitoring devices frequently used by American law enforcement, and contracts with the Pentagon for the F-35 computer components. Aside from official approval from Washington and Tel Aviv, any final agreement must clear several other hurdles, as the two companies have yet to resolve where the technology will be hosted, what countries will have access to Pegasus and other spyware, as well as the price of the sale. So I think that about covers it and gets to everything I want to talk about today. Thank you so much for once again tuning in to Conflicts of Interest. Connor Freeman, the co-host of the show, will be back later in the week for another episode and a Iran update. Thanks, everyone.